German POWs couldn't believe they performed theater in American prison camps. Behind barbed wire in the middle of nowhere, something impossible is happening. German prisoners, men captured in Africa, men who'd been told Americans were barbaric and cultureless, are standing on an actual stage. They're performing Goethe's Faust, in costumes, with lights, to a packed audience. These soldiers expected starvation, brutality, maybe death. Instead, they found Shakespeare scripts and sewing machines for costumes. They built 28 theaters across America. They performed over 2,000 shows. Some American guards, men whose brothers died fighting Germans, sat in the audience and wept. But here's what nobody talks about. When hardcore Nazis inside the camps discovered what was happening, blood was spilled. A prisoner was murdered for attending theater. The FBI was watching. And what these performances did to these German soldiers would change the entire future of a nation. How did theater, of all things, become the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal? And why did both governments bury this story for 50 years? Fort Robinson, Nebraska. December 23, 1943, 7 o'clock in the evening. The winter wind cuts across the Great Plains like a blade, rattling the barbed wire that surrounds Camp Fort Robinson. Inside Barrack 14B, Unteroffizier Wolfgang Dorschel pulls his thin coat tighter and follows the stream of fellow prisoners through the frozen mud. They've been told to report to the recreation hall. Wolfgang expects another lecture about camp rules, maybe another warning about escape attempts. He's been in American captivity for 8 months now, shipped here from the scorching sands of North Africa, where Rommel's Africa Corps met its fate. But as he approaches the building, he hears something that stops him cold. Music, not the tinny sound of a radio or the rough singing of homesick soldiers. This is different. This is an orchestra tuning their instruments. Wolfgang pushes through the door and freezes. Before him stretches a theater, a real theater, complete with a raised wooden stage, painted backdrop depicting medieval Nuremberg, and rows of benches filled with hundreds of German prisoners. On stage, men he knows, men he's shared rations with, men who fought in tanks beside him, wear elaborate costumes made from what looks like dyed cloth and cardboard. They're performing Goethe's Faust. "Mein Gott," whispers the man beside him, "this cannot be real." But it is real, and what makes it even more surreal are the American guards standing at the back of the hall. They're not pointing rifles or barking orders. They're watching. Some are even leaning forward, absorbed in the performance, though Wolfgang doubts any of them speak German. This scene, German prisoners performing high-culture theater for packed audiences in the American heartland, would repeat itself over 500 times across America between 1943 and 1946. What Wolfgang Dorschel witnessed that December night was not an anomaly. It was American policy. 7 months earlier, Wolfgang's journey to this moment began in the most unlikely way. May 15, 1943. His train rolled through Oklahoma, carrying 500 German prisoners from the port of Norfolk, Virginia, toward Camp Alva. Wolfgang pressed his face against the window, trying to reconcile what he saw with everything he'd been told. Joseph Goebbels himself had broadcasted on Reich Radio. America was starving, its cities in chaos, its farmland barren from the strain of war. The Wehrmacht intelligence briefings were explicit. American POW camps were starvation centers, where Geneva Convention rules were ignored, where German soldiers would face the same fate as Soviet prisoners in German camps. But outside Wolfgang's window stretched endless fields of wheat, golden and abundant. At every stop, the train was met not by angry mobs, but by Red Cross workers offering coffee and sandwiches. Real coffee, white bread with meat. More food than German civilians had seen in years. His diary, discovered in his grandson's attic in 1987, captures his confusion. May 15, 1943. Third day on American train. They feed us 3 times daily. Hot food. The guard, a Negro soldier, which itself defies comprehension, offered me a cigarette and smiled. I do not understand this war anymore." When the train finally stopped at Camp Alva, Oklahoma, Wolfgang expected to see the familiar architecture of captivity: guard towers, searchlights, dogs, the whole apparatus of imprisonment he'd helped construct for Allied prisoners in Africa. Instead, he found neat rows of tar paper barracks with actual windows. Inside each barrack, real beds with mattresses, not straw, electric lights, indoor plumbing. But the truly incomprehensible sight was the bulletin board in the mess hall. Pinned there, between duty rosters and mail call announcements, was a handwritten notice: "Theater auditions tonight. All welcome. Bring your talent." Wolfgang stared at it for so long that Hans Mueller, a former bank clerk from Munich, had to shake his shoulder. "It's a trick," Hans muttered. "Has to be." It wasn't a trick. That night, 43 German prisoners showed up to the auditions, still suspicious but curious. The American camp education officer, Lieutenant James Morrison, a high school drama teacher from Iowa before the war, greeted them with a smile and broken German. "Willkommen zum Theater," he said, his accent terrible but his enthusiasm genuine. What happened next would haunt Wolfgang for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Morrison opened a wooden crate and began pulling out scripts. German scripts: Schiller's William Tell, Lessing's Nathan the Wise, even Goethe's Faust. These weren't propaganda materials or American plays forced upon them. These were the cornerstone works of German culture, the very plays the Nazis had either banned or twisted for their own purposes. "Where did you get these?" demanded Hauptmann Erich Reichert, a former lawyer who still carried himself with Prussian dignity, despite his faded Afrika Korps uniform. Morrison's answer, through a fellow prisoner who spoke English, was simple: the International Red Cross, the YMCA. Your culture belongs to you, not to the Nazis. You're free to perform whatever you choose. Free. That word hung in the air like an accusation. That first night in Camp Alva, only 12 men stayed for the full audition. The rest left, confused, angry, or frightened. Some whispered about collaboration. Others simply couldn't process the cognitive dissonance. They were prisoners of the enemy, yet being offered more cultural freedom than they'd had in Germany for years. But Wolfgang stayed. Something in him, something he thought had died in the African desert, stirred when he held that script of William Tell. He'd acted in his gymnasium school plays before the war, before the Wehrmacht, before the whole world went insane. Reading Schiller's words about freedom and resistance to tyranny, he felt like he was touching a piece of his soul he'd forgotten existed. The next morning, Wolfgang woke to find a package on his bunk. Inside, 2 yards of white cloth, a box of fabric dye, 3 needles, thread, and a note in broken German. "For costumes. More available if needed. Lieutenant Morrison." This was not what prisoners of war were supposed to experience. Everything in Wolfgang's military training, every piece of propaganda he'd absorbed, every assumption about American barbarism was crumbling. The Americans weren't just allowing theater. They were funding it, encouraging it, providing materials for it. But why? The answer lay in a classified memo that wouldn't be declassified until 1975. Written by Brigadier General Blackshear M. Bryan, commander of the Enemy Prisoner of War Information Bureau. Dated April 3, 1943, it read, "The German soldier has been indoctrinated to believe Americans are uncultured, materialistic, and brutal. He expects to be treated as he has treated others. We will shatter this worldview not through propaganda lectures or forced education, but through actions. We will show them that democracy's strength lies not in its ability to destroy, but in its respect for human dignity and culture. Let them perform their Goethe and Schiller. Let them see that we are not threatened by German culture. We are threatened only by Nazism. The distinction will do more to win this war than any bullet." This policy would transform 425,000 German prisoners across 511 camps in 44 states. By the time Wolfgang witnessed that performance of Faust at Fort Robinson in December 1943, 28 camps had developed full theatrical programs. Camp Concordia in Kansas had built a 500-seat theater. Camp Hearn in Texas had formed a 30-piece orchestra. Camp Trinidad in Colorado was preparing to stage Wagner's Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, an opera about German artistic tradition that the Nazis had claimed as their own. The statistics were staggering. German POWs in America received 3,300 calories daily, more than German civilians, more than some American civilians dealing with rationing. They had access to musical instruments, art supplies, books, and sports equipment. They were paid for their labor in camp script they could use to buy luxuries at camp stores. They could pursue education through correspondence courses. But nothing compared to the theater. The theater was where something profound was happening, something neither captors nor captives fully understood at the time. That December night at Fort Robinson, as Wolfgang watched his fellow prisoners perform Faust, the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something larger than entertainment. On stage, Mephistopheles tempted Faust with power and knowledge. In the audience, German soldiers who had followed their own devil sat in the darkness, beginning to remember who they were before the uniforms, before the war, before the madness. When the performance ended, the applause was thunderous. German prisoners and American guards clapped together. Some men were crying. Hardened Afrika Korps veterans who had survived Kasserine Pass and El Alamein were wiping their eyes like children. Wolfgang would write in his diary that night, December 23, 1943. Tonight I watched German prisoners perform Faust in an American prison camp in Nebraska. I do not understand this world anymore. We were told Americans had no culture, no soul, yet they give us back our own culture, our own soul. They let us be German without being Nazis. I think this distinction will drive me mad, or perhaps it will save me. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. June 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The temperature pushes past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity makes the air feel like breathing through wet cotton. In Barrack 7, Feldwebel Hans-Georg Richter lies on his bunk, staring at a letter that has just arrived through the International Red Cross. It's from his wife in Hamburg. She writes about the bombing raids, the lack of food, the children asking when Papa will come home. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she adds, "The radio says you are all starving in American camps, but your letters say otherwise. I don't know what to believe anymore." Hans-Georg doesn't know how to respond. How can he tell her that he ate bacon for breakfast, that he's gained 12 pounds since his capture in Tunisia, that yesterday he played violin in a chamber music quartet, performing Mozart for an audience that included the American camp commander's wife? Everything is upside down. Everything he was taught, everything he believed, is crumbling like the Afrika Korps did in the desert. The propaganda had been so clear, so consistent. Hans-Georg can still hear Goebbels' voice crackling through the radio in their bunker outside Tunis. The Americans are mongrels, a mixture of races, with no culture, no history, no soul. They are merchants and gangsters, Al Capone and Wall Street. They know only jazz music and Hollywood. They could never understand Beethoven or Goethe. They will treat German prisoners like the Soviets do, with brutality and starvation. The Wehrmacht intelligence briefings had been even more specific. Colonel Friedrich von Stauben had personally briefed Hans-Georg's unit before the American offensive. If captured, expect no mercy. The Americans have been corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro blood. They will work you to death in their camps, just as the Soviets do to our men. That pause. Hans-Georg remembers that pause. Even then, even in the depths of his indoctrination, he'd noticed how von Stauben caught himself before mentioning what Germany did to its prisoners. But now, in Camp Hearn, Hans-Georg lives in a different reality. The camp library, yes, there's a library, has 5,000 books, including German classics that have been banned in Germany itself. Yesterday he read Heinrich Heine, the Jewish German poet whose works were burned in 1933. He read Heine in an American prison camp while his countrymen at home could be arrested for possessing the same book. The cognitive dissonance is driving men mad. Not literally, though there have been suicides, but mad in the sense that their entire worldview is fragmenting. In the mess hall, conversations have taken on a surreal quality. "They showed us a film last night," says Obergefreiter Kurt Wegner, a mechanic from Dresden. An American film, The Grapes of Wrath, about poor Americans during their depression. Propaganda, spits Lieutenant Friedrich Müller, one of the true believers who still gives the Hitler salute each morning. But it shows America in poverty, in struggle, Kurt insists. What kind of propaganda shows your own country's failures? Friedrich has no answer. None of them do. The theater becomes the epicenter of this psychological earthquake. When Hans Georg auditions for the camp production of Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio, he's handed a score that's been donated by the San Antonio Symphony. The conductor is Maestro Wilhelm Hoffmann, former assistant director of the Berlin State Opera, who was captured when his unit was overrun at Kasserine Pass. Hoffmann hasn't touched a baton in 3 years. When the American captain hands him one, a real conductor's baton, not a stick or a makeshift substitute, the old musician breaks down, sobbing. "And I don't understand," Hoffmann says to Hans Georg later in the privacy of their barracks. "We bombed their London. We're killing their boys in Italy right now. Why do they give us this?" The answer comes from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Roy Coleman, a black soldier from Alabama, is assigned to help with the theater construction. The prisoners are initially terrified of him. Nazi propaganda portrayed black Americans as savage subhumans. But Coleman speaks fluent German, learned from his professor at Tuskegee Institute, and he has a wicked sense of humor. One evening, as they're building risers for the audience, Coleman says to Hans Georg, "You know what's funny? You're shocked we treat you well, but you're prisoners. You have no power. It costs us nothing to be decent to you. The real test of a nation's character is how it treats its own people when nobody's watching." He doesn't elaborate, but Hans Georg sees something in Coleman's eyes, a weight that has nothing to do with guarding German prisoners. Later, Hans Georg will learn about segregation, about lynching, about America's own struggles with racial hatred. But in this moment, he's struck by the paradox. A black American soldier treated as a second-class citizen in his own country, guarding German prisoners who are treated better than many American minorities. The preparations for Fidelio consume the camp. It's an opera about political imprisonment, about a woman who disguises herself to save her husband from an unjust dungeon. The irony is lost on no one. They're prisoners performing a story about escaping prison. But the Americans not only allow it, they encourage it. Lieutenant Morrison provides $500 for materials. The prisoners transform flour sacks into 18th century costumes. They build a dungeon set from scrap wood that's so realistic, visiting Red Cross inspectors initially think it's an actual punishment cell. The camp electrician, a prisoner named Joseph Hartman who worked in UFA film studios before the war, creates lighting effects using tin cans and colored paper. But not everyone supports the production. There's a shadow organization in the camp called the Holy Ghost, made up of die-hard Nazis who police their fellow prisoners for signs of defeatism or collaboration. They leave threatening notes under bunks. They organize secret trials in the latrines. They beat suspected traitors with soap-filled socks. Unteroffizier Paul Kramer, who agreed to play Florestan, the imprisoned hero, receives a note. Performers are collaborators. Collaborators are traitors. Traitors don't make it home. Kramer shows the note to Sergeant Coleman, who shows it to the camp commander, who makes an announcement at the next roll call. Any prisoner who interferes with cultural activities will be transferred to the punishment camp at Alva, Oklahoma, where there are no theaters, no libraries, and no privileges. You will spend the rest of the war breaking rocks in the quarry. The threat works mostly. The Holy Ghost goes underground but doesn't disappear. They watch, they wait, they make lists of names. Opening night arrives, July 15th, 1943. The temperature has dropped to a merciful 85 degrees. The mess hall has been transformed into an opera house. American officers sit in the front rows. German prisoners fill the rest. Even some local civilians have been allowed in, much to the fury of many Texans who have sons fighting in Europe. As the overture begins, Hans Georg, playing first violin, looks out at the audience. He sees American Colonel Benjamin Foster sitting next to Hauptmann Erich Reichert. He sees Sergeant Coleman standing at the back, tapping his foot to the music. He sees hardened Wehrmacht veterans leaning forward in anticipation. He sees 19-year-old boys who were in the Hitler Youth 2 years ago, their faces soft with wonder. The opera begins. Florestan, the political prisoner, sings from his dungeon, "Gott, welch dunkel hier." God, what darkness here. The words resonate through the hall with layers of meaning none of them could have anticipated. When Leonore, disguised as the boy Fidelio, descends into the dungeon to save her husband, when she pulls a pistol on the tyrant Don Pizarro and declares, "First kill his wife," the audience gasps. This is not just opera. This is their story, inverted and reflected back at them. They are the prisoners, but they are also, in some way, they're only beginning to understand, the tyrants who created the need for prisons. The Americans are their captors, but also impossibly their liberators, not from the camps, but from something deeper. In the climactic moment when the prisoners emerge from their dungeons into the light, singing Beethoven's Hymn to Freedom, Hans Georg sees something extraordinary. Colonel Foster is crying, not subtle tears, but openly weeping. Later, Hans Georg will learn that Foster's son, a bomber pilot, was shot down over Germany 2 weeks ago. His status is unknown. After the performance, there's a reception. American officers and German prisoners mingle over coffee and cookies, an surreal scene that would be unimaginable in any German POW camp. Colonel Foster approaches Maestro Hoffmann. "Thank you," Foster says in careful German. "That was... thank you." Hoffmann doesn't know how to respond. He's conducted Fidelio at the Berlin State Opera for party officials who sat stone-faced through the entire performance, interested only in its propaganda value as German art. Here, in a prison camp in Texas, an American colonel thanks him with tears still wet on his cheeks. That night, Hans Georg writes to his wife, "My dear Greta, you ask what I should believe. Believe this. I am well. I am fed. Today I played Beethoven for Americans who wept at our German music. I don't understand this war anymore. I don't understand anything. But I'm beginning to think that's the first step toward understanding everything." He wants to write more, to tell her about Sergeant Coleman's kindness, about the library full of banned books, about the strange freedom he feels in captivity. But he knows the Nazi censors read the mail that goes through the Red Cross, so he adds only, "Kiss the children for me. Tell them Papa is learning new things." 3 days later, the camp newspaper, yes, German POWs publish their own newspapers in American camps, runs a review of Fidelio. The reviewer, a former critic for the Berliner Morgenpost, writes, "In performing Beethoven's Ode to Freedom while behind barbed wire, we have discovered something profound. We are more free as prisoners in America than we were as soldiers in the Wehrmacht." The Holy Ghost organization marks his name on their list, August 12, 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas, 2 in the morning. Gefreiter Johann Kunze. Can't sleep. It's not the Kansas heat. The prairie wind through the barracks windows is almost cool. It's not homesickness. He made peace with that months ago. It's the rehearsal he attended yesterday that keeps him awake. Lines from Shakespeare's Hamlet running through his mind in German. Sein oder nicht sein. Das ist hier die Frage. To be or not to be. Johann shouldn't have gone to the rehearsal. The Holy Ghost had warned him. His bunkmate, Stabsgefreiter Otto Richter, made it clear. Theater is collaboration. Shakespeare is English propaganda. Stay away or you're a traitor. But Johann went anyway. He had to. Before the war, before the uniforms and the oath to the Führer, he was a literature student at Heidelberg University. Shakespeare was his thesis topic until Jewish professors were expelled, and Shakespeare was declared incompatible with the German spirit. Now in a prison camp in Kansas, he watches former Berlin actor Fritz Rumpf inhabit Prince Hamlet with a depth and pain that transcends language, nationality, and the barbed wire surrounding them. The production is ambitious. 63 prisoners involved. Costumes created from dyed sheets and cardboard. A skull carved from soap for the gravedigger scene. But it's Rumpf's performance that haunts Johann. When Hamlet contemplates suicide, when he rages against his mother, when he sends Ophelia to a nunnery, Rumpf isn't just acting. He's exorcising demons that every man in the audience carries. Johann knows he should report to his work detail in 5 hours. Instead, he gets up, walks to the latrine, and writes a letter he'll never send. Dear Professor Goldstein, I don't know if you're still alive. I heard you escaped to England before they came for you. I wanted you to know that I'm watching Hamlet performed in a Kansas POW camp. You were right. Shakespeare is universal. Even here, especially here, he speaks to us. I'm sorry for my silence when they removed you. I was a coward then. Perhaps I still am, but at least now I know it. He tears up the letter and flushes it down the toilet. When he turns around, Otto Richter is standing there. Writing to someone, Johann? Just couldn't sleep. Otto steps closer. His breath smells like the contraband schnapps some prisoners brew from potato peels. You went to the rehearsal yesterday. It's not a question. Yes, after we warned you. It's just a play, Otto. Otto's fist connects with Johann's stomach before he can react. Johann doubles over, gasping. Nothing is just anything, Otto hisses. Every action is political. Every choice is a declaration of loyalty. You choose Shakespeare over the fatherland. Johann wants to say that the fatherland is in ruins, that their Africa Corps is destroyed, that the war is lost. But he just nods and stumbles back to his bunk. The next morning, the theater wars escalate. During breakfast, the camp divides visibly. Those involved in theatrical productions sit together on the left side of the mess hall. The Holy Ghost sympathizers occupy the right. The majority, the uncommitted middle, spread themselves strategically, trying to avoid taking sides. Fritz Rumpf stands up during morning announcements. At 43, he's older than most prisoners, his theatrical bearing intact despite the prison uniform. Gentlemen, he says, his voice projecting without shouting, I invite you all to our performance of Hamlet next week. We perform not as Germans or as prisoners, but as human beings, exploring what it means to be human. Traitor! Someone shouts from the right side of the hall. Rumpf doesn't flinch. If examining our conscience through art is treason, then I gladly plead guilty. But I ask you, who are the real traitors? Those who keep German culture alive, or those who would destroy it in the name of a politics that has already destroyed Germany? The mess hall erupts. Men shout, chairs scrape, fists fly. American guards rush in, billy clubs raised, but they can't tell friend from foe in the melee. It takes 20 minutes to restore order. 15 prisoners are sent to solitary confinement, including both Fritz Rumpf and Otto Richter. But the American response surprises everyone. Instead of shutting down the theater program, Colonel William Holden, Camp Concordia's commander, makes an announcement that afternoon. The theater program will continue. Any prisoner who interferes with cultural activities will be transferred immediately to the labor camp at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. There you will cut timber 12 hours a day. No theater, no library, no recreation. Your choice, gentlemen. That night, a 16-year-old American girl named Dorothy Cruz sneaks through a gap in the fence she's discovered. She's been doing this for weeks, drawn by the sound of rehearsals floating across the wheat fields. Her German immigrant grandparents taught her the language, though her father forbids her to speak it now. His hardware store window was smashed after Pearl Harbor just for having a German name. She finds Fritz Rumpf in the theater building, released from solitary and immediately back to rehearsing despite a black eye from the morning brawl. "You shouldn't be here, Fräulein," he says gently. "I want to help," Dorothy says. "Your English pronunciation in the Shakespeare, it needs work. I can teach you." It's absurd. A farm girl from Kansas secretly teaching former enemies to properly pronounce English while performing the greatest English playwright. But Rumpf accepts. Over the next week, Dorothy sneaks in every night, coaching the actors on Shakespeare's rhythms, his wordplay, his double meanings that survive even in translation. She writes in her diary, discovered in 2003 when she donated it to the Eisenhower Library, August 18th, 1943. "Papa would kill me if he knew. But when Fritz recites 'to be or not to be' with tears in his eyes, I don't see a Nazi. I see a human being remembering what he used to be before the war made him into something else. Maybe that's what theater is for, to remind us who we really are." The performance date approaches. The Holy Ghost makes one last attempt at sabotage. They spread rumors that the FBI is photographing everyone who attends, creating lists of collaborators to be handed over to the Soviets after the war. It's an effective threat. Many prisoners have families in areas that might fall under Soviet control. But something unexpected happens. Master Sergeant Roy Coleman, the blackguard who's been helping with set construction, addresses the prisoners during evening roll call. He speaks in perfect German. "Gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something about lists and fear. Where I come from in Alabama, there are people who make lists too. Lists of black folks who try to vote, who try to get educated, who try to be fully human. They use those lists to terrorize us, to keep us afraid, to keep us less than human. Don't let anyone do that to you here. Not the Nazis among you. Not anyone. You want to watch some Shakespeare? Watch Shakespeare. You want to remember you're human beings with souls? Remember it. That's not collaboration. That's resistance." His words spread through the camp like wildfire. A black American soldier comparing the Holy Ghost to the Ku Klux Klan. The parallel is so unexpected, so uncomfortably accurate, that even some Holy Ghost sympathizers begin to question their position. Opening night. August 25th, 1943. The theater is packed. 500 German prisoners, 30 American guards and officers, and hidden in the lighting booth, Dorothy Cruz. The local American Legion has protested outside the gates all day, holding signs reading "No entertainment for Nazi murderers" and "Remember Pearl Harbor." But Colonel Holden has held firm. As the lights dim, Johann Kunze sits in the middle section, having made his choice. Otto Richter and the Holy Ghost leadership sit in the back, watching, recording names. Fritz Rumpf enters as Hamlet, and from his first line, the audience is transfixed. This is not just a performance. It's an exorcism. When Hamlet sees his father's ghost, every man in the audience sees their own ghosts. Friends dead in Africa, civilians dead in bombings, innocents dead in the machinery of war. "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark," Marcellus says, and nervous laughter ripples through the audience. Something is indeed rotten, and it's not in Denmark. The play builds toward its climax. Hamlet's feigned madness mirrors their own disorientation. Ophelia's real madness reflects what's happening to Germany itself. When Polonius is stabbed behind the arras, several prisoners flinch. They've seen too much real death to watch fake death casually, but it's the play within a play that creates the most tension. Hamlet stages the mousetrap to catch his uncle's guilt. As the players perform, showing a king murdered by poison poured in his ear, the parallel becomes unavoidable. They are watching a play about political murder and moral corruption. The layers of meaning stack upon each other until the very air in the theater feels charged. In the final act, as bodies pile up on stage, Gertrude, Claudius, Laertes, Hamlet, the audience sits in absolute silence. When Horatio speaks the final lines over Hamlet's body, promising to tell his story truly, Fritz Rumpf breaks character for just a moment, looking directly at the audience. "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels, sing thee to thy rest." The silence holds for 10 seconds. Then Johann Kunze stands and begins clapping. One by one, others join him. Soon the entire theater is on its feet, except for the Holy Ghost section. The applause goes on for 5 minutes. Fritz Rumpf bows, tears streaming down his face. Dorothy Cruz watches from the lighting booth, her hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. Colonel Holden stands and addresses the audience in careful German. "Thank you for reminding us that culture belongs to humanity, not to nations or politics. You honor Shakespeare. You honor art. You honor yourselves." That night, the Holy Ghost holds a secret trial in Barrack 9. Johann Kunze is found guilty of collaboration. The sentence is death. 3 days later, Johann's body is found in the latrine, beaten to death with clubs made from rolled newspapers stuffed with rocks. The American investigation identifies 5 suspects, all Holy Ghost members. They're transferred to a maximum security camp in Oklahoma. But Johann's death doesn't stop the theater. If anything, it accelerates it. Prisoners who were neutral choose sides. A memorial performance of Hamlet is staged, with Johann's empty chair on stage throughout. A spotlight on it during Hamlet's "to be or not to be" soliloquy. Fritz Rumpf speaks at Johann's funeral, held in the small cemetery outside the camp where German prisoners who die in captivity are buried with full military honors. Another incomprehensible American gesture. Johann Kunze died because he chose art over ideology, humanity over hatred. He died a prisoner of war, but he lived, in his final days, as a free man. That is more than many of us can say, whether we're behind barbed wire or not. The theater wars continue, but the tide has turned. By September 1943, Camp Concordia's theater group has grown to 120 members. They begin preparing their next production, Schiller's William Tell, a play about resistance to tyranny. Dorothy Cruz continues her secret visits, now bringing English translations of German plays, American newspapers, and something even more precious, hope that the world after the war might be different from the world that created it. In her diary she writes, September 3rd, 1943. Fritz told me tonight that theater is a form of resistance. I asked him, resistance against what? He said, against forgetting who we were before we became who we are. I think about that a lot. These men were someone's sons, brothers, husbands before they were soldiers. The plays help them remember. Maybe that's what art is for, to help us resist becoming only what circumstances make us, to insist on remaining human when everything pushes us toward being less. October 1944, Aliceville, Alabama. Betty Hancock sits in her Ford pickup truck outside Camp Aliceville, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turn white. She's been sitting here for 20 minutes, engine off, watching German prisoners march past the fence on their way to evening activities. Her neighbor, Ruth Morrison, sits beside her, holding a flyer that's been circulating through town. Camp Aliceville Theater presents Mozart's The Magic Flute, October 15th, 8 p.m. Local civilians, welcome with military approval. We shouldn't be here, Betty says for the 3rd time. Ruth doesn't respond immediately. Her own son is with Patton's Third Army, somewhere in France. Every day without a telegram is a good day. Finally, she says, Margaret Foster went last week. To that Beethoven concert. She said it was beautiful. Margaret Foster's a fool, Betty snaps, but her voice lacks conviction. The truth is, Betty's son Tom died in Normandy 4 months ago. D-Day +3, 20 years old. His last letter sits in her purse, worn soft from handling. Mom, I'm scared, but I'm doing what's right. We have to stop them. Kiss Dad for me. I love you. And now them, the enemy Tom died fighting, are performing opera a mile from her house. Worse, they're performing it well, according to the town gossip. The camp newspaper, which somehow finds its way into town, reviews these performances like they're at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. There are photographs of German prisoners in elaborate costumes, their faces painted, their expressions transported. They look like artists. They look human. That's the problem. Betty starts the engine. We're going home. No, Ruth says quietly. We're going in. Ruth, I need to see them. I need to see who my William is fighting. I need to understand. They sit in silence for another minute. Then Betty turns off the engine again. Inside the camp, a different drama unfolds. Colonel Frank Bell has just received a delegation of local ministers, businessmen, and the president of the Aliceville Women's Club. They're not protesting the theater program. They're asking to expand civilian attendance. It's causing division in the community, says Reverend James Patterson, First Baptist Church. Half the town thinks we're betraying our boys overseas. The other half, well, they're curious. Some have already attended. They come back changed. Changed how? Colonel Bell asks. Mrs. Eleanor Davis, president of the Women's Club, speaks up. My nephew was killed in Italy. I went to hate them, to see the monsters who killed James, but I watched them perform Schubert's Winterreise last month. One young man, couldn't have been more than 19, sang about loneliness and longing for home with such pain that I saw my James in him. I saw every mother's son. I left more confused than angry. Colonel Bell understands the complexity. He's been wrestling with it himself since taking command 6 months ago. His orders from Washington are clear. Maintain security, maintain Geneva Convention standards, and when possible, foster cultural exchange that may aid in post-war democratization of Germany. But how do you explain to a Gold Star mother that her son's killers deserve Mozart? The theater program continues, he says finally. Civilian attendance will be permitted but not required. Anyone who objects is free to stay home. But I'll tell you what I tell my staff. These men are out of the war. They'll never fight again. What happens in these camps might determine whether their children fight our children 20 years from now. We can treat them as permanent enemies, or we can show them another way. The choice is ours. Meanwhile, in the camp workshop, Unteroffizier Karl Becker puts finishing touches on a papier-mâché dragon for the magic flute. Karl was a set designer for Munich's Staatsoper before the war. Now he creates magic from garbage. Tin cans become armor, newspapers become boulders, flour sacks become royal robes. The Americans provide $500 monthly for materials, but Karl has learned to make beauty from almost nothing. It's a skill he developed in Germany as resources dwindled. Here, in abundance, his creativity explodes. It's better than anything I built in Munich, he tells his assistant, young Private Emil Hoffman, who at 17 is the youngest prisoner in camp, captured in Italy when his unit of Hitler Youth was thrown into combat. Emil doesn't understand. How can it be better? We have nothing here. Karl stops painting and looks at the boy. In Munich, I built what they told me to build. Every set had to serve the party's message. Here, I build what Mozart requires. That's the difference between propaganda and art. The distinction is lost on Emil, who still believes, despite everything, that the Führer will somehow win the war. But he's skilled with his hands and eager to please Karl, who has become a father figure in the absence of his real father, dead in Russia since 1942. Opening night arrives, October 15th, 1944. The Camp Theater, built by prisoners from salvaged lumber, seats 800. Tonight, 600 German prisoners fill the back sections. In the front, separated by a rope barrier and American guards, sit 200 American civilians, the largest civilian attendance yet. Betty Hancock and Ruth Morrison are among them, having finally entered the camp after their long hesitation in the parking lot. Betty wears black, still in mourning for Tom. Ruth clutches her purse, which contains William's latest letter and a small pistol she couldn't bring herself to leave at home. The lights dim. The orchestra, 30 German prisoners with instruments provided by the YMCA and local donations, begins the overture. The first notes of Mozart fill the air, playful, profound, utterly removed from the world of war outside. Hauptmann Wilhelm von Steuben, playing Sarastro, enters in robes made from dyed bedsheets. His bass voice, trained at the Berlin Conservatory, fills the theater with such power that several American women gasp. This is not what they expected from a Nazi prisoner, but Wilhelm isn't a Nazi, never was. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1935 because it was that or unemployment. He kept his head down, followed orders, and survived. Now, playing the wise priest Sarastro, he sings about brotherhood, wisdom, and the triumph of light over darkness. The irony is not lost on him, or the audience. As the opera progresses, something shifts in the room. The magic flute itself, carved by a prisoner from a piece of Arkansas pine, becomes a symbol everyone understands. Art as the instrument of transformation. When Pamina and Tamino sing their duet about love transcending all barriers, Betty Hancock finds herself crying, not gentle tears, but body-shaking sobs she has to muffle with her handkerchief. At intermission, American civilians and German prisoners awkwardly share the same refreshment area. Coffee and cookies prepared by German cooks are served by German prisoners to American civilians. The absurdity of the scene, enemies sharing snacks during an opera intermission, strikes everyone simultaneously. Mrs. Davis approaches a young German prisoner who played Papageno. In broken German, she says, "You sing beautifully." He responds in accented English, "Thank you, gracious lady." I am Otto. Before the war, I teach music to children in Bremen. I teach piano, Mrs. Davis says. Taught. I taught my nephew. She trails off. Otto understands. I am sorry for your loss, he says simply. Are you sorry for the war? She asks, surprising herself with the directness. Otto looks around, checking who might be listening. Every day I am sorry. We follow the devil thinking he was an angel. Now we sing Mozart in prison while Germany burns. This is justice, perhaps. The second act begins. The trials of fire and water, which Tamino and Pamina must pass to prove their worth, take on new meaning in this context. Everyone in the theater is undergoing their own trial. Prisoners, testing whether their humanity survived the war. Americans testing whether they can see humanity in their enemies. The Queen of the Night's aria, with its famous high F notes, is performed by Feldwebel Erich Hartmann, a female impersonator from Berlin's cabaret scene, another category of person who couldn't exist openly in Nazi Germany. His coloratura soprano, achieved through years of training, is so pure that several American women whisper, "Is that really a man?" The gender-bending performance adds another layer of subversion to an evening already thick with contradictions. As the opera reaches its climax, with the forces of light defeating the Queen of the Night, Colonel Bell watches from his box seat. He sees Betty Hancock in the third row, no longer crying, but transfixed. He sees his own officers leaning forward, absorbed. He sees German prisoners in the back, some singing along under their breath, others with closed eyes, transported home. He thinks about the letter he'll have to write to Washington, explaining this scene. How do you tell generals fighting a war that their enemies perform Mozart with such skill that American civilians pay to watch? How do you explain that these performances might be doing more to win the peace than any propaganda program could achieve? The opera ends with the chorus singing about the triumph of beauty and wisdom. The applause is immediate and thunderous. German prisoners and American civilians stand together, clapping until their hands hurt. Otto takes his Papageno bow and accidentally makes eye contact with Betty Hancock. She nods at him, a small gesture that costs her everything and nothing. After the performance, as civilians file out, Ruth Morrison says to Betty, "They're boys. Just boys, like our boys." "No," Betty says firmly. Then, softer, "But maybe they were boys before they became soldiers. Maybe they can be boys again after." In the camp newspaper the next day, the review by Gefreiter Hans Müller, former critic for the Frankfurter Zeitung, includes this line: "We performed the magic flute for our captors, and in the music, captors and captives disappeared. There were only human beings, sharing beauty in the midst of ugliness, finding light in darkness." The American Aliceville Mirror runs its own review, written by Mrs. Davis. "I attended the German prisoner performance expecting to see enemies. I saw instead young men far from home, creating beauty from scraps, finding dignity in captivity. I'm not ready to forgive what Germany has done, but I'm beginning to understand that Germany is not just what it did, it's also what it was before and what it might become after. These prisoners, through Mozart, showed us all three. The reaction in town is explosive. The American Legion organizes protests. The Women's Club splits into factions. Reverend Patterson preaches about forgiveness, while Reverend Thompson from Second Baptist preaches about righteous anger. The town divides between those who've attended performances and those who refuse. But something has started that can't be stopped. By November, civilian attendance at camp performances has tripled. Local music teachers begin donating instruments. The Aliceville Library starts a German-language section. Some families even invite prisoners on work detail to eat dinner with them, a violation of regulations that Colonel Bell carefully doesn't notice. Betty Hancock returns for the next performance and the next. She never speaks to the prisoners, never smiles at them, but she comes. In December, she brings Tom's violin, unused since his death, and donates it to the prison orchestra. The card reads simply, "From an American mother to someone else's son." Otto receives the violin. He plays it in the camp's Christmas concert, Silent Night, first in German, then in English. Betty Hancock sits in the front row, tears streaming down her face, as the voice of her enemy sings the carol Tom loved most, playing Tom's violin with a tenderness that breaks her heart and begins to heal it simultaneously. November 1944, Washington, D.C. Office of Strategic Services Headquarters. Major James Harrison reads the report for the third time, chain-smoking lucky strikes despite his wife's protests about his health. The document, stamped "Classified Eyes Only," contains surveillance reports from 28 POW camps across America. The subject, German theatrical performances and their psychological impact on prisoners. "So what you're telling me," Harrison says to his assistant, Captain Dorothy Walsh, one of the few female intelligence officers in the OSS, "is that German prisoners are accidentally denazifying themselves through dinner theater?" "It's more complex than that," Walsh responds, spreading photographs across his desk, images of elaborate productions, prisoners in costume, audiences of hundreds. "Look at the attendance records. We're tracking which prisoners attend, which perform, and more importantly, which actively resist. The theater has become a perfect sorting mechanism." She points to a chart. Prisoners who participate in or regularly attend cultural activities show a 73% rate of what our psychologists call ideological softening. They stop giving the Hitler salute. They cease discussing wonder weapons. They begin questioning what they were told about America. More importantly, they're beginning to question what they were told about everything. Harrison leans back. "And the Bureau wants us to exploit this?" "Not exploit. Enhance. Guided democratization through cultural engagement. Make them choose between Nazi ideology and German culture. Force them to realize they can't have both. The operation, codenamed Spotlight, has been running for 6 months without the prisoners' knowledge. OSS agents, posing as YMCA workers and Red Cross inspectors, have been carefully curating which plays, operas, and musical pieces reach the camps. Nothing overtly political. That would be too obvious. Instead, they provide works that celebrate individual dignity, question authority, or explore moral complexity. Take this example, Walsh continues, pulling out another file. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. We provided them with Schiller's Don Carlos, a play about resistance to tyranny, written by a German, performed by Germans, for Germans. No American fingerprints on the message. Result? 3 separate discussion groups formed spontaneously to debate the ethics of resistance. These are Wehrmacht officers debating whether they should have resisted Hitler. Harrison whistles low. How many prisoners are we talking about? Currently, 47,000 actively participating in cultural programs, another 150,000 attending as audience members. That's nearly half of all German POWs in the country. But Spotlight has a darker edge. The OSS isn't just observing, they're recruiting. Prisoners who show genuine democratic transformation are marked for potential use in post-war Germany. They're looking for future mayors, police chiefs, teachers, Germans who can help rebuild without the Nazi poison. At Camp Hearn, Texas, this secret war plays out in miniature. Feldwebel Hans-Georg Richter, the violinist we met earlier, has no idea that his weekly chess games with YMCA volunteer Robert Anderson are actually intelligence debriefings. Anderson, real name Lieutenant Colonel Robert Steinberg, speaks flawless German and has been carefully guiding Hans-Georg toward certain realizations. Tell me about last night's performance, Anderson says, moving his bishop. Hans-Georg considers his next move. We performed Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All men will be brothers. Strange to sing about universal brotherhood while at war. Do you believe it, that all men can be brothers? Hans-Georg captures a pawn. 6 months ago, no. Germans were superior. Others were inferior. Simple. Clean. Now, I play music with a Negro sergeant who knows more about Bach than most Germans. I take English lessons from a Jewish corporal whose parents fled Munich. My worldview is, he searches for the word, contaminated. Anderson hides his satisfaction. Hans-Georg is exactly the type they're looking for. Intelligent, culturally sophisticated, beginning to question but not yet fully turned. These men will be crucial in post-war Germany. Contaminated or clarified? Anderson asks. Meanwhile, at Camp Concordia, Kansas, a different intelligence operation unfolds. The FBI, not to be outdone by the OSS, has placed informants among the prisoners. Their mission: identify and isolate die-hard Nazis who might form resistance cells after repatriation. Their key asset is Obergefreiter Paul Zimmermann, though that's not his real name. He's actually Sergeant Paul Zimmermann, U.S. Army Intelligence. Born in Milwaukee to German immigrant parents, speaks perfect German with a Bavarian accent. He was captured in Italy and inserted into the POW population 9 months ago. Zimmermann has successfully infiltrated the Holy Ghost organization by pretending to be a fervent Nazi. He attends their secret meetings in the latrines, memorizes their kill lists, documents their plans to continue the fight after the war. It's dangerous work. If discovered, the Holy Ghost would murder him as they did Johann Kunze. Tonight, there's a special meeting. The Holy Ghost leadership has learned something that has them in a panic. Theater participants are being given preferential treatment for work release programs. Prisoners who perform or help with productions can work on local farms, earning money and interacting with American civilians. It's a powerful incentive that's drawing men away from Nazi ideology. It's deliberate, insists Hauptmann Friedrich Wessel, the Holy Ghost leader. The Americans are using culture as a weapon. They're making us choose between being German and being National Socialist. Then we make examples, says another member. Anyone who performs dies. Zimmerman memorizes every face, every name. Tomorrow, these men will be transferred to maximum security camps. They don't know it yet, but their war is over. The intelligence war takes an unexpected turn when Dorothy Cruz, the farm girl who's been secretly teaching Shakespeare to the prisoners, is discovered by camp authorities. Instead of arresting her, Colonel Holden makes a calculated decision. He brings her to his office where Anderson from the OSS is waiting. "Miss Cruz," Anderson says, "you've been breaking federal law by entering a POW camp without authorization. That's a serious crime." Dorothy goes pale but lifts her chin. "Then arrest me. Or," Anderson continues, "you could work for us officially. Continue what you're doing but report back on what these men say when they think no Americans are listening." "You want me to spy on them?" "We want you to help us understand them. These men will return to Germany soon. We need to know which ones will help rebuild and which ones will try to restart the Nazi movement. Your theatrical friends might be the former. Help us identify them." Dorothy struggles with the moral complexity. These men trust her, but she also understands the stakes. What about Fritz Rumpf? He's not a Nazi. He never was. "We know," Anderson says, showing her a file with Rumpf's photo. "He's on our list of potential cultural ambassadors for post-war Germany. Your instincts about him confirm our assessment." Dorothy agrees, becoming the youngest intelligence asset in Kansas. Her reports, written in her neat schoolgirl handwriting, provide invaluable insights into the prisoner's psychological transformation. One report reads, November 15th, 1944. Fritz told the cast that performing Hamlet makes him question every order he followed in the war. He said Hamlet's hesitation to act isn't weakness, it's moral consciousness. He wonders how many Germans had moral consciousness but killed it to follow orders. The younger prisoners listen to him like a father. His influence is spreading. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, another intelligence victory unfolds. The camp's production of Wagner's Die Meistersinger becomes a flashpoint. Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer, represents everything about German culture the Nazis claim to embody. But the opera itself is about artistic freedom, the value of tradition, and the danger of rigid rules. Hauptmann Wilhelm von Steuben, playing Hans Sachs, delivers the final monologue about honor and German art. But he changes the words, slightly, carefully, but significantly. Instead of holy German art, he sings holy human art. Instead of German masters, he sings worthy masters. The changes are subtle enough that non-German speakers miss them, but every German in the audience hears them. It's a declaration of independence from Nazi ideology, performed through Wagner himself. The Holy Ghost marks von Steuben for death, but the FBI is watching. That night, 17 Holy Ghost members are transferred to a maximum security camp in Oklahoma. Von Steuben never knows how close he came to death, or that his subtle resistance was exactly what American intelligence hoped to see. By December 1944, Spotlight has identified 3,000 prisoners as potential leaders for democratic Germany. These men don't know they've been selected. They won't know until 1946, when they're offered early repatriation and positions in the American-occupied zones administration. But the intelligence war has an unintended consequence. Captain Walsh notices it first in the statistics. Suicide rates among German prisoners dropped 60% in camps with active theater programs. Letters home become more hopeful. Work productivity increases. These men aren't just being denazified, they're being healed. "We started this to identify future allies," Walsh tells Harrison. But something else is happening. These men are recovering their humanity through art. They're remembering who they were before the war transformed them into something else. Harrison, ever practical, responds, "That's useful too. Broken men don't rebuild nations. Healed men do." The intelligence services begin to realize that the theater programs aren't just sorting mechanisms or propaganda tools. They're something more radical, a form of cultural therapy that's achieving what forced re-education never could. by letting German prisoners freely choose between Nazi ideology and German cultural tradition, by showing them they could be German without being Nazi. The Americans have found a weapon more powerful than any bomb. As 1944 ends, a classified report crosses President Roosevelt's desk. It details the success of the POW theater programs, the intelligence gathered, the transformations documented. FDR's response, scrawled in the margin, "Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to remind him he's human. Continue the programs." December 23, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado. The snow falls heavy and silent on the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, transforming the prison camp into something from a Bavarian Christmas card. Inside the massive recreation hall, 400 German prisoners make final preparations for tomorrow night's performance, the most ambitious yet attempted in any POW camp. Wagner's complete Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, all 4.5 hours of it. Obergefreiter Martin Schulz, former principal tenor of the Dresden State Opera, stands on stage in a costume that would grace any professional opera house. The prisoners have worked for 6 months on this production, and it shows. The sets, painted on salvaged lumber, depict medieval Nuremberg in stunning detail. The costumes, sewn from donated fabric and dyed flour sacks, rival anything in metropolitan opera houses. The 45-piece orchestra has rehearsed until their fingers bled. But this morning brought devastating news. The camp radio, which pipes in war updates, announced the German offensive in the Ardennes, what Americans call the Battle of the Bulge. German forces have broken through, thousands are dying in the snow, and for the first time in 2 years, Germany appears to be winning something. The prisoners are torn. Should they celebrate this last gasp of the Wehrmacht? Should they cancel the performance out of respect for the dying? The camp divides into fierce debate. Martin addresses the assembled performers. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we perform Wagner while our comrades die in Belgium. We sing about German art while Germany destroys itself." What are we doing? Young Emil Hoffmann, the 17-year-old Hitler youth we met earlier, speaks up. "We should cancel. It's disrespectful to perform while Germans fight." But Maestro Wilhelm Hoffmann, no relation, the former Berlin State Opera conductor, disagrees. "No, we perform precisely because men are dying. We perform to prove that something will survive this war, that German culture is bigger than Nazi politics." Wagner wrote about the triumph of art over rigid rules. Could there be a more appropriate time? The debate rages for an hour. Finally, Hauptmann Erich Reichert, the former lawyer who has become the camp's moral authority, stands. "I propose this. We perform, but we dedicate it to all the dead. German, American, British, Russian, all of them. We perform not as Germans or prisoners, but as human beings insisting that beauty matters, especially when the world is ugly." The vote is close. 218 for, 182 against. The performance will go on. That evening, something extraordinary happens. Colonel Robert McKenna, Camp Trinidad's commander, visits the German barracks. He's never done this before. He finds Martin Schulz and speaks through an interpreter. "Mr. Schulz, I've just learned that my son, Lieutenant James McKenna, was killed yesterday in the Ardennes. My wife says I should cancel your performance. The town wants me to cancel it. Part of me wants to cancel it." He pauses, struggling. "But I'm not going to. You'll perform Wagner tomorrow night, and I'll be in the audience, because if we stop believing in beauty and culture and humanity, then my son died for nothing." The colonel leaves. The barracks sit in stunned silence. Martin will later write in his diary, "The American colonel's son died fighting Germans yesterday. Tomorrow he'll watch Germans perform Wagner. I don't understand this kind of strength." December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. The performance hall fills with an unprecedented audience. 400 German prisoners, 100 American military personnel, and, for the first time, 200 civilians from Trinidad and surrounding towns, including many who have lost sons in Europe. The tension could be cut with a knife. In the front row sits Colonel McKenna, his wife Margaret, still in black mourning clothes. Beside them, inexplicably, sits Frau Ingrid Reichert, wife of Hauptmann Reichert. She was visiting from Mexico, where German civilian families wait out the war, when news came of the Ardennes offensive. She could have left but chose to stay for her husband's performance. At 7 p.m. sharp, Maestro Hoffmann raises his baton. The prelude to Die Meistersinger begins, that magnificent musical sunrise that seems to promise that darkness always yields to light. The orchestra, despite everything, plays flawlessly. These men, who haven't touched professional instruments in years, who learned their parts on instruments held together with wire and prayer, create pure magic. Martin Schultz enters as Walter von Stolzing, the young knight who challenges the rigid rules of the Mastersingers Guild with his revolutionary approach to art. As he sings his trial song in Act 1, his voice soars with a power that makes several audience members gasp. This is not a prisoner performing. This is one of Europe's great tenors at the height of his powers. But it's the character of Hans Sachs, the wise shoemaker poet played by Hauptmann Wilhelm von Steuben, who becomes the emotional center of the performance. Sachs represents the best of German tradition, wise, humble, open to change. When he sings the wan monologue in Act 3 about the madness that grips mankind, the parallel to current events is unavoidable. Madness, madness, everywhere madness. Wherever I search in the world's chronicle, seeking reason in human affairs, all I find is madness. Mrs. McKenna begins crying silently. Her husband takes her hand. The performance builds toward the famous quintet in Act 3, one of the most beautiful passages Wagner ever wrote. 5 voices interweave in complex harmony, each singing different words but creating unified beauty. As the music swells, something breaks in the audience. The artificial barriers between prisoner and guard, enemy and civilian, begin to dissolve. They're all just human beings, sharing transcendent beauty while the world burns. During intermission, an unprecedented mingling occurs. German prisoners and American civilians share coffee and Christmas cookies. Frau Reichert speaks with Mrs. McKenna, both in broken English and German, both mothers fearing for their children. "Your son?" Frau Reichert asks gently. "Dead. Yesterday. The Ardennes. I am so sorry, my son is 16. Hitler Youth. I don't know where." They stand together, 2 enemy mothers united in grief and fear. The second half of the opera continues with even greater emotional intensity. The famous Prize Song, where Walter finally masters the traditional form while maintaining his revolutionary spirit, becomes a metaphor everyone understands, honoring tradition while embracing change, being German without being Nazi. Then comes the finale, Hans Sachs's warning about German art. This is the passage the Nazis loved, with its nationalism and cultural pride. But tonight, in this context, the words transform. When von Steuben sings "Honor Your German Masters," he gestures not to any flag or symbol, but to the orchestra, the singers, the very act of creation itself. He's not singing about political Germany, but about the eternal Germany of Bach, Beethoven, and Goethe, the Germany that existed before Hitler and will exist after him. As the opera reaches its climax, with a full chorus singing about art's triumph over politics, Private Emil Hoffmann watches from the wings. The 17-year-old Hitler Youth, who arrived believing in final victory, now understands that Germany is already defeated. But watching this performance, he also understands that German culture will survive. He begins crying for his dead father, for his broken country, for his stolen youth, for the beauty that somehow persists despite everything. The opera ends. The silence lasts 10 seconds, an eternity in theater time. Then Colonel McKenna stands and begins clapping. His wife stands beside him, tears streaming down her face. One by one, the entire audience rises. The ovation lasts 15 minutes. Martin Schulz steps forward and speaks in accented English. "Ladies and gentlemen, we dedicate this performance to all who have died in this terrible war, German and American, soldier and civilian. May music heal what politics has broken." Then something unprecedented happens. The German prisoners begin singing Silent Night, first in German. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The American guards join in English. The civilians add their voices. For 3 minutes, enemies sing together about peace on earth. Mrs. McKenna will later write to her sister, "I went to that performance to hate them, to see the monsters who killed James. Instead, I saw boys like James, far from home, creating beauty in captivity. When they sang Silent Night, I heard James singing it as a child. I don't forgive what Germany has done, but I understand that these prisoners are more than what Germany did. They're human beings trying to remember their humanity." The camp newspaper, written by German prisoners, publishes a special Christmas edition. The editorial by former journalist Heinrich Müller includes, "Last night we performed Wagner for Americans whose sons are dying fighting Germans. They applauded us. They sang with us. This is either madness or grace, perhaps both. But in that shared music, we glimpsed what might be possible after the war. Not just peace, but reconciliation." The American Trinidad Chronicle covers the story with the headline, "Christmas Miracle at POW Camp, Enemies United in Song." The article describes the surreal scene of German prisoners and American civilians celebrating Christmas Eve together through Wagner and carols. But not everyone approves. The American Legion organizes protests. Letters to the editor condemn coddling Nazi murderers. Some families of soldiers fighting in the Ardennes are outraged that German prisoners performed while American boys died. Yet something has shifted. The performance becomes legendary, spreading through the POW camp network and the local community. More civilians request permission to attend future performances. Some begin bringing Christmas packages for the prisoners, a violation of regulations that authorities carefully ignore. On Christmas Day, the prisoners hold their own celebration. Protestant and Catholic services are conducted by prisoner chaplains. The camp kitchen, staffed by German cooks, prepares a feast with ingredients provided by the Americans. Turkey, stuffing, pies, food most Germans haven't seen in years. Emil Hoffmann writes a letter home that will never be sent. Germany is in chaos. Mail cannot get through. "Dear Mother, today is Christmas. I'm 17, a prisoner in Colorado. Last night I watched German opera performed for Americans whose sons we killed. They applauded us. Today they fed us Christmas dinner. I don't understand this world anymore. The Americans treat us better as prisoners than our own government treated us as soldiers. Maybe Father was wrong about them. Maybe we were wrong about everything." That evening, Colonel McKenna visits the German barracks again. He brings his son's violin, James played in his high school orchestra, and gives it to the camp musicians. "For your orchestra," he says simply. "My son would want his music to continue." Martin Schulz accepts the violin with shaking hands. "We will treasure it. And when we play it, we will remember your son, and all sons lost to this madness." The Christmas of 1944 at Camp Trinidad becomes a moment of transformation. The successful performance of Die Meistersinger, the shared singing of carols, the exchange of grief between enemies. These create cracks in the wall of hatred that war builds. 3 days later, news arrives that the German offensive in the Ardennes has failed. The war's end is now certain, but in Camp Trinidad, something has already ended. The ability to see enemies as only enemies, through Wagner and Christmas carols, through shared tears and applause. Prisoners and captors have remembered that they are all human beings caught in history's machinery, trying to preserve what beauty they can while the world burns. As 1944 becomes 1945, the theater programs across America's POW camps intensify. The prisoners know the war is ending, Germany is destroyed, and they must decide who they'll be when they return to the ruins. Many choose to be what they were in these camps: artists, musicians, human beings who created beauty in captivity and were applauded by their enemies for doing so. March 1946, Stuttgart, Germany. The ruins stretch as far as Wolfgang Dorschel can see. Where the Staatstheater once stood, only broken walls remain. Wolfgang touches the rubble, remembering the last time he was here. 1941, on leave, watching Don Giovanni with his wife Greta. Now Greta stands beside him, a stranger, hollow cheeks, aged 10 years and 3. "You look well fed," she says. It's not a compliment. Wolfgang has gained 20 pounds in American captivity. He performed in 37 plays, 8 better than civilians, even learned jazz piano from a black sergeant. Greta survived on 1,000 calories a day, dodging bombs. "The Americans," he begins. "They treated you well?" She cuts in. "They burned Dresden. They burned Hamburg. But they treated you well." This scene repeats across Germany as 425,000 POWs return from America. Healthy, transformed, but alien. Civilians see them as collaborators, soft men who sat out the real war in comfort while the homeland burned. Fritz Rumpf, the actor from Camp Concordia, returns to Berlin. His wife dead, his apartment gone, his children scattered. The Americans who tracked him through OSS files offer him a role rebuilding German theater, to show Germans they can be German without being Nazi. His first Hamlet performance in a bombed church draws only 17 people, but he persists. Dorothy Cruz, the Kansas farm girl, sends him packages with coffee, chocolate, and plays like Arthur Miller's All My Sons. In Munich, Carl Becker, the set designer, faces hostility. "You built sets in Alabama while we dug bodies from rubble," colleagues accuse. Carl doesn't argue. In America, he learned German culture could survive without Nazi ideology. The returnees find each other, calling themselves Die Amerikaner. They form orchestras and theaters in ruins. Hans-Georg Richter starts a small symphony in Hamburg. Their first concert is Beethoven's Ninth, the same they played in Texas. Letters from guards like Sergeant Roy Coleman remind them, "I had more freedom guarding Germans than in my own country." Keep playing music. It's the only thing that makes sense anymore. American intelligence activates its network. The 3,000 POWs marked under Project Spotlight are quietly offered positions as mayors, teachers, cultural officers. Wolfgang Dorschel becomes assistant director of Stuttgart's Reconstruction Committee. At a town meeting, a grieving woman screams, "You learned this in comfort while we burned. You're a traitor." Wolfgang doesn't deny her pain. Instead, he tells them about Faust in Nebraska, about American guards crying at German music, about farmers who fed him Thanksgiving dinner. "Enemies are made, not born," he says. "And if they can be made, they can be unmade." Emil Hoffman, the 17-year-old Hitler youth from Colorado, returns to Würzburg. His father dead, his city 90% destroyed. But Emil carries jazz sheets copied by hand from the camp. He plays them in a surviving cafe, mixing Beethoven with Duke Ellington. Old Germans sneer degenerate. Young Germans flock to listen. The returnees are distrusted by all sides. Soft Americans to their own people. Suspected Nazis to Americans. Spies to Soviets. They exist in a liminal space, transformed by an experience no one else understands. But they persist. By 1947, many occupy key positions in West Germany's democratic institutions. They become teachers, journalists, policemen, cultural leaders. Wolfgang Dorschel is elected mayor of a Stuttgart suburb in 1948. His campaign poster shows him performing William Tell in Camp Alva. His slogan, "I learned freedom as a prisoner." Now I bring it home. He wins by 12 votes. Hans-Georg Richter, now conductor of the Hamburg Symphony, puts it best in 1951. We went to America as Nazi soldiers. We returned as democratic Germans. This transformation didn't happen through propaganda or force. It happened through theater, through music, through being treated with dignity we didn't deserve. We discovered that German culture was bigger than Nazi ideology. That discovery saved our souls. Now we must use it to save our country. 1952. Washington, D.C. Pentagon Archives, Sublevel 3. Colonel James Harrison, formerly of the OSS, feeds documents into an incinerator. Each page contains evidence of Spotlight, the intelligence operation that used theater to transform German POWs. His assistant, Dorothy Walsh, watches. "We're destroying evidence that we succeeded?" she asks. "We're destroying evidence we were soft on Nazis while American boys died," Harrison replies. Imagine the headlines: "Government-funded opera for Hitler's soldiers while GIs died in snow." In Bonn, West Germany, a similar silence falls. Chancellor Adenauer's government discourages talk of comfortable captivity that might anger civilians who endured bombing, hunger, and occupation. Returned POWs like Wolfgang Dorschel are told, "Your experience was valuable." But speaking of it publicly complicates our unity. His photographs of Camp Alva go into a box in the attic. Letters with American guards stop. This isn't conspiracy, it's consensus. Both nations prefer simpler stories. America wants victory remembered through military might, not cultural grace. Germany wants unity through shared suffering, not division between starving civilians and well-fed prisoners. By 1955, the theater story has disappeared from official history, but buried history never vanishes completely. In 1962, Dorothy Cruz, now Dorothy Palmer, begins collecting testimonies. She writes to men she knew in Kansas, asking them to record their memories before they fade. Responses pour in. Martin Schultz, the tenor from Camp Trinidad, writes, "I performed for Americans whose sons I may have killed, and they wept at my voice. Yet here in Austria I cannot mention this. To speak of comfort in captivity is to be called a traitor." Fritz Rumpf, director in Stuttgart, confesses, "I learned democratic participation through theater in a Kansas camp, but I cannot say this aloud. I credit various influences. The truth that American imprisonment taught me freedom is too paradoxical." Over 20 years, Dorothy gathers 847 testimonies, unpublished and stored in her basement under the title Theater Behind Barbed Wire. No German or American press will touch it. Too controversial, too complicated. In 1975, the first crack appears. Under the Freedom of Information Act, the National Archives declassifies Brigadier General Bryan's original memo, "We will defeat Nazi ideology by respecting German culture." A graduate student, Michael Thompson, stumbles across it and writes a dissertation on POW theater. His professors warn, "You're suggesting America's greatest victory wasn't military, but cultural." He defends anyway. The dissertation vanishes into archives. In Germany, rediscovery begins through families. Klaus Richter finds letters from his father, Hans Georg, to Sergeant Roy Coleman, a blackguard in Texas. The friendship shocks him. His formal distant father once debated Bach and jazz with an American soldier. Other children of POWs uncover similar traces, programs, photographs, diaries, and form a circle they call Kinder der Amerikaner. They face resistance from older Germans who prefer silence, but the questions will not go away. 1987, Dorothy Palmer donates her collection to the Eisenhower Library. A small exhibition, Stages of Democracy, German POW Theater in Kansas, draws modest attention. But a Kansas City Star article spreads nationally, then internationally. For the first time, the buried story resurfaces. Wolfgang Dorschel, now 81, gives his first interview to Der Spiegel. "We performed Schiller and Shakespeare while Germany burned. Americans applauded us while their sons died. That paradox broke us. It shattered our certainty about enemies and superiority. Theater saved us from becoming permanent prisoners of hatred. The reaction is explosive. Some call him a traitor. Others, relieved, finally understand their father's strange affection for America. Fritz Rumpf, dying of cancer, makes his last statement. "I spent 2 years as a prisoner in Kansas. They were the freest years of my life under Hitler or Stalin." Democracy isn't a system. It's a faith that humans can choose goodness even when everything pushes toward evil. I learned this faith in captivity. Still, official histories resist. American textbooks emphasize military triumph. German narratives emphasize suffering and rebuilding. POW theater remains a footnote. 2003. Dorothy Palmer dies at 86. Her granddaughter Sarah uploads her manuscript online. For the first time, theater behind barbed wire becomes accessible worldwide. Responses flood in from Australia. "My grandfather was a guard in Texas. He said German prisoners taught him opera from Germany. My father came home with jazz records and American plays. Now I understand why." From Japan. "If enemies could transform through art, maybe hatred isn't permanent." The story spreads through documentaries, conferences, and exhibitions in Kansas, Texas, and Alabama. German television produces Die Amerikaner, a miniseries on POW theater, but mainstream histories remain cautious, unwilling to highlight kindness in the middle of total war. 2018. Wolfgang Dorschel dies at 99. His final words, "America taught me to be human again." At his funeral in Stuttgart, the daughter of Lieutenant Morrison, the Iowa drama teacher, reads from her father's diary. August 1943, the German prisoners performed William Tell tonight. Watching enemies become artists, seeing them struggle with freedom and tyranny, I understood. Democracy's greatest weapon isn't its armies, but it's to see humanity in enemies. This may be the most important work I'll ever do. The words receive polite applause, then fade again into silence. But the evidence remains. Testimonies, letters, photographs, all proving that for 2 years in POW camps across America, enemies performed theater together and rediscovered their humanity. Dorothy Palmer's conclusion, once rejected, now reads like prophecy. This is not a story about American goodness or German redemption. It is about what happens when enemies meet as humans, when art transcends politics, when dignity is offered to those who don't deserve it. German POWs couldn't believe they performed theater in American camps. Americans couldn't believe they applauded enemy artists while their sons died. Both discovered that enemies are made by circumstance and can be unmade by grace, too powerful for its time, perhaps too powerful for any time. But it happened. And what happened once can happen again. 425,000 German prisoners did perform theater in American camps. American guards did applaud enemy artists. Transformation did occur through dignity and art. Democracy did spread through experience rather than force. Enemies did become friends. These are facts, not sentiment. The world of today seems no closer to accepting these lessons than the world of 1945. We still create enemies, still choose punishment over transformation, still suppress stories that complicate our preferred narratives. Yet the POW theater story insists on hope, despite evidence. It whispers its subversive truth. Another way is possible. It has been done. It can be done again. Every time someone chooses to see humanity in an enemy, to create beauty in ugly circumstances, or to extend dignity where it isn't deserved, the echo continues. The disbelief is the point. German POWs couldn't believe they performed theater in America. Americans couldn't believe they applauded. We can't quite believe it either. That disbelief marks the boundary between what we think is possible and what actually is. The story ends where it began, with disbelief. But disbelief was the beginning of wisdom. In every theater, in every prison, In every place where enemies recognize each other's humanity, the curtain rises again. The POWs discovered that enemies are made by circumstance and can be unmade by grace. They discovered they could be German without being Nazi, prisoners while being free, enemies while still human. Their disbelief turned into belief, their captivity into liberation, their enmity into recognition. Not through victory, but through the radical act of making art together. The stage is still waiting. The scripts are ready. The question is whether we are ready to perform the same miracle, seeing enemies as future friends, extending grace to the graceless, believing that art can transform what politics cannot. The German POWs couldn't believe it, neither can we. But perhaps disbelief is where transformation begins.